Thanks very much, Kay. We should do a poll here as well of what the city thinks in terms of the most famous Yorkshireman. But in the meantime, David Cameron, as we've been hearing, has been telling the Conservative Party conference that he'd balance the nation's books. He's also promised tax cuts for hard-working families. Well, if the Conservatives win the next election, he's pledged to lift the tax-free allowance from £10,500 to £12,500. And for higher earners, he's going to raise the 40p tax threshold to £50,000. Together, those two measures would cost an estimated £7.2 billion by 2020. So what does this all mean? Let's crunch some numbers. Sam Bowman is the research director at the Adam Smith Institute, which specialises in tax and issues like that. It's great to have you here with us, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
Sounds great, doesn't it? He's going to raise the tax-free allowance, and also we're going to have a higher threshold for higher tax earners. Makes for great headlines, but does that actually mean a lot to people?
Well, it is good news. The key point on the upper tax band is that usually we don't raise this in line with inflation. So that means that every year as inflation rises, more and more people get drawn into the upper tax band. So if we look at CPI, raising this to £50,000 by 2020 is a little bit of a gain for people. It means slightly fewer people will be paying this upper rate of tax. If we look at retail prices, which includes things like house prices, then it's really just tracking that. So
we're playing catch-up, effectively.
So we're basically playing catch-up, and a lot of people have been brought into this because of this fiscal drag, which is what we call it, over the past couple of years. It's good news. It's definitely going in the right direction, but it's not the huge kind of headline tax cut that people might want you to think. What's interesting, what I think is the really good news, and the thing that we're really happy about, is the personal allowance being raised. Because what that means is that people on the minimum wage, who earn about £12,500 a year, won't be paying any income tax at all. If you're a full-time minimum wage worker, the only tax you'll be paying is in national insurance. And that's something the government hasn't addressed, but it's a really good step.
So it means that effectively you are getting more like something like the living wage, as many people call it, if you're on minimum wage, which of course is great news if you're...
Well, exactly. This is the really interesting thing. Every year we hear about the living wage, which is essentially the amount of money you would need to earn what most people think is a basic standard of living. The problem is if you raise the minimum wage to the living wage, you're going to kill jobs. You put people out of employment. It's generally a bad thing, and most economists agree that it's a bad thing to do. The interesting thing is the after-tax living wage is approximately the same as the pre-tax minimum wage. So if we want to give people on the minimum wage a living wage, just take them out of tax.
Quite clever in that sense.
It's a great way of doing it. Plus, it makes work pay more, so you complement the government's welfare agenda. You get more people going into work and so on. So it actually, even though it looks as if it'll cost £5.6 billion, probably you have more taxpayers ultimately, so it'll be a good thing.
There's the rub, Sam. It's a clever measure, but you're going to have to pay for it. And £7.2 billion in total, you don't find that kind of money down the back of a sofa. You know, realistically, how are they going to pay for this? What can you do? This
is the tough question. I think probably more cuts could be made across the board. I actually think that the ring fencing of the NHS is a really, really big problem. The NHS is the #1 expenditure, and until the government really tries to grasp that, I mean, Cameron's actually announced that he's not going to touch the NHS, which I think is a bad idea. But I also think that the government could be doing a lot more on growth. There are things like planning reform, which would definitely add a couple of percentage points to growth that would cost the government nothing. You could do that very easily, and you'd add a lot more to government revenue and to overall wealth. But also there are things like monetary policy. Right now we're looking at a very, very tight monetary policy. If the Bank of England loosened policy a little bit, that would improve, I think, a huge amount the economy. We'd see those improvements very quickly. And overall, you would see more people going into jobs and greater economic growth in the long run. That's a great way to pay for these things. Look at it as a positive-sum game rather than just as a balance sheet measure. OK, that's something the Bank of England, of course, has to get to grips with, of course. Sam, great to talk to you. Thank you. Elsewhere, shares in Tesco are now worth only half of what they were